Welcome back to the program, and on this second section, we discuss the issue on health digest, which was on blood transfusion and blood donation. And today with me on the panel is Joe Wangendo. Joe Wangendo is the founder and the executive director of Bloodlink Foundation. Previously, he's been the general manager of Heart to Heart Foundation, which started the Dettol Heart Run, which is now called the Matter Heart Run. He was the executive officer of the Kenya Medical Association. Currently also is the secretary of the Kenya Association of Fundraising Professionals, that is consulted for many organizations, including Oxfam, IBFAN, FAWE, and amongst others. Also with me on the panel is Dr. Victor Ngani. Dr. Victor Ngani is the medical director at one of our leading private hospitals in the country. Previously, he's been the ICU coordinator at the Mater Hospital. He was the founding chairman of the Kenya Medical Practitioners, Pharmacists and Dentists Union. He holds a Bachelor of Medicine and Bachelor of Surgery degree from the University of Nairobi and currently pursuing health economics and policy. So to start us off in this discussion on blood transfusion and blood donation, we talked to one of the highest donors in the country, Sanya Alpha Kennedy. He's a father of 3. He works as a county prosecutor at the Nakuru County. He's been donating blood for the last 34 years, and so far he has donated 85 times, making him the highest donor in the country. He does so faithfully without fail, and this is his story.
In 1983, when I was in Pumwani Secondary School in 3rd form. And what had happened is my desk mate, I remember he used to be called Mutinda. I was reading a novel in class, so he came and he had a soda. So I asked him, where did you get the soda? Because in secondary school, sodas are the main thing. So he told me, you go and donate blood, you'll get your soda. And that's what I did. I went, I donated blood, I had my Fanta, and I was okay. But since then, I got that urge to be donating blood. I realized, if I would save a life in that way of donating blood, why not continue and make a difference in somebody's life? So since then, I think I've made a difference in so many people's life, and we've never met, and I just feel it's a blessing. Okay, number one, one should be in good health, over 50 kilos, and have that willing to make a difference in somebody's life, positive difference. And you eat well. Basically, water is the main thing. I drink lots of water, eating vegetable, having fruits in your diet, exercising. I do a lot of walking. You'll always have a checkup, medical kind of checkup before you donate blood. And if it is okay, you'll donate. If it is not, they'll always advise you. But you'll never have that issue of donating and then you're falling sick or something. We've never had that issue. I've never encountered any health problem issue ever since I started donating blood. I've never encountered. I think the best thing I've had through donating blood is being recognized by the head of state. Immediate family, no, but there's a time some relatives called me. They wanted blood in Kenyatta National Hospital. It was on a Sunday. That blood group that he needed was not at Kenyatta that particular time, so they had to source from another hospital. It was not a good feeling, and I think that's why most Kenyans, if we have enough stock in our blood banks throughout the country, we'll never have these issues. Because I think annually Kenya needs around 400,000 units of pints of blood every annual year. So if you do your simple calculation, maybe around 90,000 per county. If we can encourage Kenyans at the county level to donate, and so that our blood banks have enough stock, we'll never have this issue of blood again. They was captured in secondary school. If we can encourage from the secondary school level, once we capture those youth at that particular time, it becomes a habit. You'll never change. Yeah, because once you're out of school, people find it very hard to now come start donating, unless maybe they have a relative who needs blood in hospital. But it doesn't become something that they look forward to doing.
Okay, gentlemen, I'll start you from the last question that we asked Sanya. We are not meeting the 1% target for blood donations that will be able to sustain a country. That's at least 400,000 pints per year. Why are we there, and what do we need to do so that we are able to meet the blood demands in the country? I'll start with you, Joe, now that you deal directly with the blood.
Thank you, Mercy. I think I'll state that the mandate for blood donation and blood services in this country is vested on the Kenya National Blood Transfusion Service. There's policies and guidelines, but unfortunately that mandate is not anchored in law, meaning there is not enough resources, so the service is not sufficiently funded. It's actually a division under a department within the Ministry of Health. So there's been issues about resources or sufficient funding for the service. But going forward, I think the future looks brighter. Under the newly enacted health law, there's provision for establishment of a Kenya National Blood Transfusion Service under its own act. That would mean that they would obviously have budgetary allocation directly. They would also be structured in a way that they can resource mobilize for themselves, either by producing products that would generate income. So I think going forward, there may be hope, but it's unfortunate that previously, much as it's a service that's identifiable as a service, a standalone service, in reality, it's actually a small division within the Ministry of Health. With very little allocation from the ministry.
Dr. Ngani, from a provider point of view, why are we not meeting the needs of blood across the country?
I would put it at awareness, because principally at the end of the day you must get blood from people donating, and that has to be the responsibility of every single citizen. And perhaps if more of us could take up as much ownership as Alpha has, we'll probably meet our quota. I think we can say that with certainty. Unfortunately, our societal culture has been, you only donate blood when your relative is in hospital. And we need to move away from that and say, we'll donate blood anyway because this will help somebody. And perhaps it would even help you as an individual, because the need for blood tends to be very acute and it can be very severe. And I can tell you, Dr. Korir, there is nothing worse than losing a patient on account of blood. And the number of times this has happened in this country is quite disappointing, I must say.
Okay. You talked of our society and our culture, and we know there's a religious group that is Jehovah's Witness. They actually walk around with cards saying no blood transfusion. How then do we go about some of these things? Because at that point they need blood and they cannot give you consent to give blood, or maybe blood is available, they do not donate. How do you maneuver around this? I'll start with Ngani, then so you can...
Yeah, that's a bit complicated, because every person has a right to accept or reject a particular medical intervention that is required, except when it's in the case of a minor where the doctors may make a decision on behalf of the patient. In that case, then it's a lot more complicated, because it's conflict between religion and science, and that conflict, I think, predates our nation, I must say. There are possibilities that have been explored where you could build up blood without necessarily transfusing. But then there are situations that have been critical, and we've actually witnessed loss of life of members of certain religious convictions due to the firm instruction to not transfuse. It's something that I think there's be continuous engagement on, and I don't know how that will end up, but certainly there's a clear conflict between that particular belief and current scientific proof and evidence.
Okay. Joe, from your experience?
From my experience, I think there's a small population that subscribes, for example, to that religious group that you indicated. But back to Sanya's story, I agree again with Dr. Ari here that we need to do more in terms of making sure the service is accessible to people who want to donate. If you talk to most people, they'll tell you they last donated in high school, and maybe for the soda and the loaf of bread. But also because you find the teams that go out, the outreaches, they go to high schools. So students are able to easily access the service. When you become an adult, you find that the blood centers that we have are situated in hospitals. So you find most people will not go out of their way, especially if you're healthy. No one wants to put themselves in a situation where you go to a hospital unless you have a patient. What we are trying to do and what my organization has done is try and bring the service to the people. And how we've done this is now we have two mobile blood donation buses that go out to the people, easily identifiable, so that makes it easy. So I think bringing the service closer to the people is one way to reach out to them, but again, creating awareness, not just because, again, we've seen the kind of response we get is when there are tragedies, but making sure that people are regular donors, not just when we have tragedies. And I'll give an example. From my experience in 2008, after the post-election violence, we saw that there actually was a diminished supply of blood at that point. And from last year, we came up with a strategy to address this. So since mid-May this year, we jointly with Kenya National Blood Transfusion Service had an election preparedness campaign where we aggressively went out to recruit blood donors. And we were able in 3 months to collect about 30,000 units. As we speak right now, I think the Kenya National Blood Transfusion Services have sufficient blood in their blood banks right now. We went a step further to try and get it distributed to the hospitals, which are the transfusing facilities. So I think strategies that address in the long term as opposed to the knee-jerk response where you wait for an attack or, you know, accidents that where they mass casualties and you're responding on that time. If we inculcate a culture of regular blood donation amongst Kenyans by creating awareness and also providing them with the opportunity to donate by bringing the service closer to them, I think we'll be going a long way in addressing the problem.
Okay. Talking of waiting for the knee-jerk reaction, which is what we see, because we see very many appeals on social media by the hospitals, by some of the organizations. Isn't there supposed to be a clear-cut plan, even by the facilities, the transfusing centers, and the National Blood Transfusion Service itself, in a year, to know that this is our target, the 400,000 at least, and execute that so that we don't have to wait or plan for expected disasters? Is there a plan like that?
I think I'll talk about the Kenyan situation and probably compare it with other services, you know, in similar countries as Kenya. We have, you know, from the early 80s to the, early 90s to the mid 90s, we saw that there was a crisis in terms of safety of blood. The issue of HIV came around, and the blood that was being transfused within those early years of HIV was tainted blood. So for the last, I'd say probably 10 years, there's been a lot of emphasis in terms of making sure that the blood that is transfused is safe. So the safety levels have really come down, so we can say right now that blood that's transfused from the Kenya National Blood Transfusion Service is fairly safe. Seropositivity levels for all the markers are fairly low, you know, below 1%. But that emphasis has come at the expense of making sure that we have more donors. So I think it's been, and I think that's fair because now that we know our blood is safe, then we can start placing emphasis on donor services, which is now the recruitment end of it, because I think that, again, is another specialized area. When you're dealing with blood donors, these are healthy people. They donate voluntarily. So unless you really take care of them, they won't come back. And because we're saying you need repeat donors, you have to really make sure that they come back.
Dr. Ngani?
Yeah, I must say that Kenyans are very charitable people. We are very generous. Whenever you hear blood appeal for a neighbor, you don't even know who the friend is. People participate, and when there are mass incidents, people, give voluntarily. But then what is missing is that concept and that understanding that this ought to be a continuous process. And I think then it's just, to a large extent, a continuous sensitization and continuous campaigns and a strategy, as you said, to have a consistent supply. Because having a deluge of blood at a particular point may not be as useful as having a consistent supply over a period of time. But also the other component that must not be forgotten is that whereas you have blood, you also have to have the resources in the respective areas to test this blood for safety. Issues like HIV, hepatitis, and other diseases, this has to go hand in hand with this. And together with that, the human resource that needs to make this possible to transfuse and perhaps even to receive the blood that is being given.
Okay, so as we wind up this discussion, from where you are, what is the ideal situation that hospitals or the transfusing centers and the doctors and the providers, what is the ideal situation for them when it comes to blood transfusion and blood donation services? Well,
the most ideal situation is where you have a pool of consistent donors who come in particular times and are able to meet your demand. And I think the figure from WHO is fairly accurate. About 1% of the population donating regularly will meet our demand. But it's not that clear-cut because in our country that awareness is lacking, but also in many places the resources is lacking. It's good enough to have blood in one center, but then the way of moving it to another center, distribution becomes a problem. Those are challenges that have to be overcome through system-wide adjustments.
Okay. Joe, you mentioned the Health Act that has actually put in the National Blood Transfusion Service. Do you think, in your final comments, that will be the long-term and final solution to the issue of blood across the country?
Yes. Looking around countries that have blood services enacted under an act of law, you find that, for example, Zimbabwe, where it's a semi-autonomous organization, you find that they're actually meeting their target despite all their challenges. Zimbabwe has a population of about 16 million, I believe. They achieve about a collection of about 100,000 a year. We know all the challenges that Zimbabwe has, but it's an institution that has a board. It has its own mechanism to get funding, and the blood that is given to public hospitals, actually the government pays for that blood, pays the service for that blood. I think currently they pay about $100. It's not the only country that is a success story. If you look at the South African model, it's similar. Okay. And those are countries in Africa. So I think just the way of semi-autonomy, that alone will provide the resources that are required, but also have a clear direction, have guidelines and policies that are anchored in law, because even right now as we speak, we say there are guidelines and policies, but there's no criminal element. So anyone going against those guidelines, there's nothing that will happen. So, yeah, I think that will help.
Yeah, I may just mention that whereas I know Joe has a lot more experience in this area, I may not go as far as saying that the legislation will be the solution per se. I rather consider that as a start, because then there's a process of transcribing that legislation into actual practice that then brings about the benefit, and there are many components of it as well. Okay. Yeah.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time this evening. I wish we could have had more time to have this discussion. We have just scratched the surface, so we look for more time to continue with this discussion. And that's it from me tonight. On this discussion on blood transfusion and blood donation was Joe Wangendo. Joe Wangendo is the Executive Director at the Blood Link Foundation, and Dr. Victor Ngani, who is the Medical Director at one of our leading private institutions in the country. Until next week, when we discuss other issues on health in this segment of Health Digest, I wish you a good night and a good weekend. God bless.